So welcome to Decoding the Talmud, our 6-week journey diving inside the story, substance, and significance of the book that defines Judaism. Before we begin, today we're going to be doing lesson 1, but before we begin, I wanted to just take a moment to talk about the course. First of all, some housekeeping announcements. You should have received an email from me this morning at 9 a.m. If you did, then you're doing great. That's obviously how you logged on here. And you can expect an email from me like that each week on Monday morning at about 9, 10 a.m. I send out an email reminding you that there's a class that day, sending the login information if you'll be joining via Zoom, etc. If you did not receive that email from me, so then please send me a text message or call me or stop by Chabad and let me know that you didn't get it, and because that means there's something wrong. Either your email is not on the list, or like there's something wrong with your registration, or maybe my emails are going to spam. That happens sometimes, so I would like to get that rectified. The other email you can expect from me each week is on Monday evenings at 9:30 p.m. I send out an email that includes a recording of this Zoom class. So if you're coming in person or you cannot make it one week and you want to watch the recording, that's available to you. In that email, I also link all sorts of things that I may reference throughout my lesson. So, for example, if I give a book recommendation, or I recommend a different class, or a little YouTube video, or I play a video, or my slides are also available there. So I'll link all those things in the after lesson email, like that you can explore further there. I always say the main purpose of that email is to open the conversation. I always appreciate when people hit the reply button and they let me know what they thought of the lesson, which parts they agreed with, which parts they disagreed with, which parts resonated with them, which parts they would like to protest. I like to hear all of it. And obviously you can always text me. We can arrange a phone call if you'd like to do that. But at the very least, replying to the email with any questions you may have is always encouraged. Each course has its own pace. There's kind of some courses, like the last course we did, which was called Nurturing Relationships, was more of an inspirational self-help kind of course. We had a course last year which was more Kabbalistic in nature. I feel like a lot of you felt that that maybe I lost you, and then hopefully I was able to bring you back by the end of the lesson. But it was definitely some deep stuff. This course has its own pace. I hope that you will be with me as we go through the entire thing, because it's a very practical kind of topic, and I have a feeling that you'll enjoy it very, very much. That being said, I'd like to open up the course, and particularly lesson 1, which is titled "The Jewish People in the Talmud," by discussing why Jewish life orbits a book of law. And our journey will begin with a brief video which will tell a story from the 1200s, from medieval times, about the video speak for itself. Welcome, Phil, who just arrived, and I will let the video speak for itself. Please turn your attention to the video screens.
March 3rd, 1240, was a Shabbat. But for the harassed Jews of medieval France, numbering as many as 100,000 souls, it was not to be a day of rest, but of unprecedented unrest. They were praying in their synagogues when the raid began. In cities and towns throughout the kingdom, agents of King Louis IX of France burst through the doors of Jewish houses of prayer and seized thousands of hapless prisoners. All the detainees were transported to Paris, where they were held in convents under strict guard to await their trial on accusations of grave crimes. For 3 long months, they languished in captivity until their collective trial began. Meanwhile, the Jews of the kingdom gathered continuously to storm the heavens on their behalf with fasting and prayer. 4 of the greatest luminaries of the French Jewish community, led by the highly respected Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, served as the prisoners' legal defense. Following the trial, the judges continued to debate the case for another 2 years, while European Jewry held its breath. Piney in June of 1242. 24 wagons and tightly packed convicts rolled into Place de Grave, causing the Jews of France to emit a collective groan of horror. Place de Grave was a public square along the banks of the Seine River, notorious as the historic site of public executions, hangings, beheadings, and burnings at the stake. Throngs of Parisians lined the streets to enjoy the spectacle, while those of the Jewish faith remained hidden, terrified to venture from their homes. The prisoners had been found guilty and had been sentenced to extermination through public burning. The evil verdict was carried out with glee. But as they were consigned to the flames, there were no cries of agony or despair, nor was there a smell of burning flesh, because the prisoners were not people. They were books, thousands upon thousands of handwritten scrolls and codices, every copy of the Talmud that the king's agents could find in France, almost all of which had been sheltered in the nation's synagogues, had been arrested, put on trial, and condemned to public burning. The Jewish tradition was consigned to the fire that day, and as angry flames roared at their ancient wisdom, as their teachings rose as ash, and an inferno ingested their spiritual treasures, the Jewish communities of France were singed with grief and flung into mourning for their executed pages, for their martyred beliefs.
The Jewish community of France at the time was not only one of the largest Jewish communities, it was also one of the most important. Jews from other European centers like Germany or England would flock to the yeshivot, to the Talmudic seminaries of France, to study from the great Talmudists of France. And one such man was a 20-year-old yeshiva student at the time. His name was Rabbi. Well, he became known later as Rabbi Meir, and later became one of the greatest Jewish leaders. By the way, we get from him, Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg was his name. We get from him one of the most insightful Jewish responses to hostage scenarios, which I know has become very relevant recently, and it's actually in our next JLI course. We're going to be touching on that a little bit. But for now, I want to talk about something else that he penned, which is a very, very sad and very moving poem. On Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, when we mourn the destruction of the temples. That's the day when, for the most part, we mourn all of the martyrs of the Holocaust, etc. There are lots of different moving prayers that we say then that are literally designed to make us feel the grief of all the tragedies throughout our history. It's like the day of grieving, Tisha B'Av. It's in the summer. And on page 3, text 1, Phil, if I can ask you to read it for us, please, we have this poem that Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg writes, in which he mourns the burning of the Talmud. Phil, when you're ready. You're muted, sorry. There you go.
Home in a book.
Burned treasure.
Page 1, sorry.
Page 3, I think. Text 1.
Page 3, text 1. All right. I will shed tears until they surge like a stream that will reach the graves of your two noble princes, Moses and Aaron, on the mountain of Hor, and I will require of them, will a new version of the Torah be given? Is that why your columns were permitted to be burned? My soul is astonished. Can edibles ever taste sweet to my palate now that I have watched how they gathered your treasure into the city square, like the penalty of a Jewish city that strayed to idolatry and burned the supernal treasure?
Of all, thank you, Phil, of all the poems, of all the songs and prayers that we say on Tisha B'Av, this day of sadness, this poem sticks out because it's the only one that's not for human beings. we are for the most part mourning the persecution of our ancestors. And here we're mourning the destruction of our books. Now, obviously, the Talmud as a body of work survived, but still there was such a grieving over the fact that this was, of course, before the printing press, and you have thousands and thousands of copies of Talmud, each one literally, laboriously copied from another copy, that obviously meant so much to the Jewish people that it's being treated as if human beings themselves were murdered, as if there were actual human beings that were burnt at the stake. And the question is why, or more importantly, I think the observation here is that the Talmud is much more than just words on paper. A Jew doesn't merely read Talmud. Let me pull back up my slides here. A Jew doesn't just read the Talmud. Talmud is an experience. These prisoners were not just books, but rather they were an embodiment of an experience that Jews had been experiencing for many years before then and have continued to experience since then. Think about, for example, the way Talmudic study has become part of the way of life of Jews that study Talmud. Jews that study Talmud, till today, by the way, have their own language. I'm not talking about another language like English, Yiddish, Hebrew, another language, which is the language of the Talmud. No. They use euphemisms from the Talmud that you wouldn't understand even if you knew the translation of the words, because they're constantly using them. When I sit among other rabbis, I will use that language. I'll express statements and phrases and things from the Talmud that are, if you were listening, even if it was English, you wouldn't understand it because it's this separate language. The vocabulary, the tunes, by the way, if you've ever heard somebody study Talmud, it comes with a whole different tune. It comes with different hand motions. Have you ever seen this hand motion? Right? When somebody goes like this with their finger, that comes from Talmudic study. Or points, very emphatically like this. That comes from thousands of years of people studying Talmud in that way. There are practices of the way that they study Talmud, and for many, many children, and I would venture to say even for your parents and grandparents when they were children, some of the earliest memories that they have of their fathers and grandfathers are the sound of them chanting the Talmud, chanting Torah study, chanting the Talmud. Pictured here, you see my grandfather, who's in his mid-90s. K'nai Nahara, may he live and be well. Some of my earliest childhood memories are him coming in. He was a rabbi in Brussels, Belgium. He was a rabbi elsewhere before that, but when I was growing up, he was a rabbi in Brussels. He would come to our home for Passover every year, and it was always exciting for me. I would wake up, and the first thing that I would see is him sitting and studying Talmud. That's how I knew Zaidi was here. Zaidi had arrived. And it's not even a question that everybody on this Zoom, all those that are watching this recording, and all those that will attend in person, 50 people in total that are attending this course, every single one of you, if you go back one generation, possibly two, at max three, your grandparents were sitting and studying Talmud. And it wasn't just once, it was nightly, it was weekly, it was twice a week, whatever it was. I grew up this way with my father. This has become part of the Jewish culture. And I just want to paint the picture for you to remind you when this was. I mean, our grandparents weren't, sitting on the beaches in the south of France and studying Talmud. They weren't, hanging out in cabins on vacation and studying Talmud. That's what we get the luxury of doing. But they were actually running and being persecuted and sometimes being hunted down, or even in the very best scenarios, working to make a living under very, very difficult circumstances, and yet they found the time to study Talmud. I'm going to play one more video, which is essentially, instead of reading text 2 is from Psalms. You can see it on page 5. Lulei seirascha sha'ashuai, had your Torah not been my delight, I would have perished in my suffering. I will never forget your precepts, for through them you preserved my life. There is a beautiful contemporary song, maybe 30, 40 years old, which was composed by a man named A.B. Ruttenberg. I'm sorry it doesn't have the English translation. At the in-person class, I will have a handout with the lyrics. But most of it is English. It's an English song. And then in the middle, he intersperses with this verse over and over and over again. That's kind of the refrain, text 2 from Psalms from King David. But I think it really does a great job of painting a picture of under what circumstances and how important Talmudic study was for our grandparents.
sits late at night in the soft candlelight as it casts its warm glow on the pages. And the words that he sees are the secret, the key that has kept us alive through the ages.
Why does he cherish the wisdom of old and delight in his study each day? He knows only Torah can nourish his soul. But listen and hear what he says.
Vos ofeis Hillel, vos make Beis Shammai. Rav of vos comes to lead me
Torah, without you, I surely would die. Lulei Sairas, Vashashuai.
Vos clear dravir, you know, vos trach dravashi. Chat can be traffic in Rashi.
Torah, you've given my spirit to me. Keep on, peace on me.
And now we remain with our faith yet sustained by our passion and love for this treasure.
It's our link with Sinai and our Father on high, so we'll keep on learning forever.
Why does he cherish the wisdom of old and delight in his study each day? He knows only Torah can nourish his soul.
Indeed, many historians have spoken about the importance to Jewish survival, the relevance that Talmudic study has had to Jewish survival. Cecil Roth, in his short history of the Jewish people, which is text 3 in front of us, and Kevin, if I can ask you to read it for us, actually credits the reason that Jews survived all the centuries of exile and persecution to a book. Go ahead. Kevin, can you read for us, please? On page 6, text 3.
The importance in Jewish life of the Talmud is not by any means purely academic. It comprises the accumulated wisdom of the Jewish people over many generations. The period of its redaction coincided with the growth of independent centers of life in far distant regions, cut off politically and linguistically from the former nuclei. The Jewish people was about to enter on an entirely different phase of its being in countries of which their fathers had never heard, in the face of difficulties hitherto unimaginable. But they possessed to bring with them into their new existence a code, not merely of religion or of law, but of civilization. The Talmud gave the Jew a fatherland which he could carry about with him when his own land was lost. And if he was able to maintain his identity in the course of the long centuries to come, under conditions such as no other people has ever been able to surmount, it is with the Talmud above all that the credit lies.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think this is enough of an introduction to understand just how serious of a topic we're undertaking, and how majestic of a role and how precious of a role the Talmud has had throughout the Jewish people. So with this, I'd like to dive into today's lesson and into the 6-week course. I'd like to start off by giving you an overview of what I'd like to do over the next 6 weeks. For starters, I want to talk about the style with which I'm going to be teaching over the next 6 weeks. Actually, a little bit with the exception of today, but definitely over the next 5 weeks, yes, and even today to a certain degree. Different than most of the lessons that I teach, most of the courses that I teach, where I teach you about something. Here, I'd like to be your tour guide. What I mean by that is like this. It's definitely a crash course on the Talmud, and we're going to try and understand what the Talmud is and why it's so important and how it works and the logical processes and the analysis and the way all that works. But I'd like to do that by over and over and over again diving into the text of the Talmud with you, studying a small portion, and then understanding a different element about the Talmud from that. So over the next 6 weeks, respectively, we're going to be doing the following. This week is our intro, and we're going to be discussing 2 elements of the Torah. First of all, what the Talmud is, namely that it is oral law and how that works. And number 2 is why. Why is it such an important book for the Jewish people? Why is studying Talmud such an important thing? Next week, we are going to be discussing the Mishnah, which is the origin of oral law. The 3rd week, and really the subsequent 3 weeks, we will be discussing Gemara. Let me explain the difference between those two. So whenever somebody talks about Talmud, if you open up any Talmudic tractate, so I have one on the shelf right here. Let me grab one off the shelf. If you open up any volume of Talmud and open it up to any random page, this page has got a lot going on. And over the course of the next 6 weeks, we're going to understand everything that's going on on this page. But for right now, let me just explain to you that even on this page itself, the Mishnah is written 300 years apart from the Gemara. So in other words, the text is divided into 2, and much more on that next week and in the subsequent weeks. Next week, we'll talk about the Mishnah, and then 300 years later, that evolves into the Gemara, which analyzes the oral law. Again, I know a lot of that sounds very cryptic right now, but we're going to properly understand it over the next 5 weeks. So next week in lesson 2, we'll do the Mishnah, the oral law, and then in weeks 3, 4, and 5, we'll do the Gemara. And the Gemara will be divided into 3 different aspects of it. Number 1 is to understand how the Gemara analyzes the Mishnah. We'll try and understand the Gemara across centuries. There are many different, even the Gemara itself spans 400, 500 years, and it gets compiled at the end. We'll try and understand how that works on a page and what that feels like when you're studying it. And then in lesson 5, we'll talk about the logical steps that the Talmud takes, how the Talmud goes through such a thing to unpack the Mishnah. I should mention something now, that the words Talmud and Gemara are kind of synonymous. In yeshiva, we used to call it Gemara. The word Talmud is kind of the larger world calls it Talmud, but they're kind of synonymous, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. Finally, in the 6th lesson, as we wrap our course up, I'm going to try and understand the role that Talmud has played in Jewish life overall, and how it's still an evolving exercise, and what role we play. By we I mean me, and I mean you, and all of us in the continued evolution of the Talmud. Okay? That's the plan over the next 6 weeks. And again, I'm going to try and do most of it as a tour guide. So let's start off with what is the Talmud. Hold on. I should explain. Hold on just a second. Yeah. So let's start off with what the Talmud is. Okay? On page 8, I would love if you can follow along with me. We're going to go through 10 useful facts about the Talmud. There's no better way to do this. It's a lot of information, and it's going to take us time. So let's start off with just 10 useful facts about the Talmud. And again, slowly that picture will form in your brains. Number 1 is the Talmud is a combination of 2 books. That's the first point that I already mentioned to you, the Mishnah and the Gemara. With the latter style, there's a commentary, elaboration, and analysis of the former. So you have the Mishnah is one text, and at one point, even till today, you can have a Mishnah. I don't know that I have a set of Mishnah here on the shelf independently, but you can have a set of Mishnah on the shelf independently where you just study the Mishnah. The Talmud is then, 300 years later, rabbis analyzing the Mishnah. The Mishnah was composed around 200 CE, and then the Talmud, let's get to it right now. So the Talmud, there are two versions of the Gemara. There are two versions of the Talmud. There's a Jerusalem Talmud, which is basically the in the mid 4th century in northern Israel. It's the Israeli version. So in other words, you have to figure that after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple in Jerusalem, which is around, after the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, which is around 400, 500 BCE. So after that time, the Jews are exiled. And they're not all exiled. Some of them stay in Israel, and some of them end up in Babylon. Babylon is what we know of today as Iraq, Iran, etc. Right? And as a result, there's two simultaneous bodies of wisdom, or of centers of education that evolve among the Jewish people, and they lead to two separate Talmuds. The Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, which basically means the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. The Mishnah is compiled, and today they've done this with computer. They filtered this all through computer. There's only 120 sages that are recorded in the Mishnah. So even though they span a long period, it's primarily 120 sages from different eras over a period of 150, 200 years. But they're referred to as Tanaim. That's the Hebrew term for them, is Tanaim. It means a sage from the Mishnah. After that, the Talmud, or the Gemara, compiles the teachings of approximately 800 sages. They are called Amoraim. Again, these are just random facts. I'm not going to test you on them. You don't even necessarily need to be aware of them, but it'll help you to get an idea of the Talmud, to understand a little bit of these facts. The Talmud is divided into 63 tractates. So this is one tractate. This whole book, one tractate. There's 63 of them. In total, they make up 5,422 pages, which we'll talk about in a second. Every tractate contains a mini version of it. In other words, there's the tractate, or the volume of Mishnah. And then this book is the volume of Mishnah with the analysis of the Gemara, which came later, put together in one book. Some tractates... So in other words, there were 63 tractates, and then most of them have Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud on them, on those topics, but not all of them. Some of them will have just Babylonian Talmud or just Jerusalem Talmud. Another interesting point about the Talmud is that the Talmud has a very, very set, this has to do with way later, this has to do with 19th century. Okay, so in the 1800s, there was the first printing of the Talmud. You have to figure that the printing press comes out, it takes a while until it becomes more universal, till it hits the Jewish world, etc. There was a printing house in Vilna, in the city of Vilna, where this page was printed for the first time. Okay? And ever since then, there's been almost a religious commitment to keeping the page looking exactly as it is. Okay? So anytime you open up a Talmud, here's how you would reference it, okay? So if I was giving a speech in a shul somewhere, I was invited to give a guest this coming Shabbat, I will be in Lake Havasu, Arizona. My kids have off of school, and we're going on vacation to Lake Havasu. The rabbi there asked me to give a talk there, right? If I talk in the synagogue there, and I talk about the Talmud, so the one I have right here is Bava Batra, that's the name of the tractate. What I would do is I would say the Talmud tells us in Bava Batra on page 73, that's the page I'm open up to right here. In Hebrew, you would call it Ayin Gimel, but in English, it's 73. And then I would say a side number, okay? Because the way that the Talmud is set up is that this is page 73, both sides. Does that make sense? And then this would be side A, or in Hebrew, side Aleph, and side B, which is in Hebrew, side Bet. In other words, if I was standing there at the pulpit, it would be perfectly reasonable for me to say, if you open up to Bava Batra, Daf Ayin Gimel, Amud Aleph, the fifth line from the top, and everybody would know exactly where I am. Why? Because every Talmud, the first word on the page and the last word on the page are exactly the same. The setup is exactly the same on every single page in any Talmud around the world. Ever since they printed it in Vilna, there's been this adherence to that. And today, nobody is about to change that because there's been so many references that have been made, not to, chapter this, verse this, but the references have been made based on the folio, in other words, the double-sided page, and then which side of the page, and then which line it's in. So it kind of needs to stay that way. So in English, when they do that, look at point number 10. In English, when they cite the Talmud, citations will usually include the tractate name, the folio number, and then a letter indicating site A or B. So look at their example there. They say it would be Pesachim, that's the name of the tractate. So in this instance, Pesachim is about Passover. That's the topic, happens to be. And they would say folio 99, means page 99, but it's a double-sided page. So then you would say B, which tells you that it's the second side of the page. I hope that makes sense. Unless otherwise specified, almost all Talmudic references are Babylonian Talmud and not Jerusalem Talmud. That's the more popular, the more commonly studied of the two of them, if you will. But what's on these pages? What is being discussed in the Talmud? We've done 10 facts about them, but it's really been very just historical and general facts. What is discussed on the pages of this Talmud? So the answer really in a nutshell is 3/3 halacha. I'm sorry, 3/4 halacha. Okay? And throughout this course, anytime I introduce a new key term, you will have it in your textbook. So the word halacha is a Hebrew word. It means Jewish law. And for the most part, that is what is discussed in the Talmud. Let me give you an example. But again, like a tour guide, we're going to dive in, and then I'm going to show you what we're looking at here, okay? So if you open up your textbook to page 9, I should say 9 and 10, you will see that we have 4 quotes from 4 different tractates on 4 different pages, all right? I rarely call attention to the sources of the text that we're reading, but today I want to do that. Take a look. Text 4a is from the Talmud, Pesachim 99b. So that tells you the tractate, the folio, and the side, right? Keep going. 4b, right? Talmud Bava Metzia 75b. Text 4c, Talmud Yuma 6a. And then text 4d, Talmud Sanhedrin 90a. So none of them are in this tractate, are in this book. I would need to pull off a different one off the shelf, right? And I would need to use that one. By the way, another random thing, which maybe I should have mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, which really shows the importance of Talmud, in observant circles, like people that actually keep all the Torah and mitzvot, right? It is customary that when a man gets married to a woman, the father of the woman buys the son, the incoming son-in-law, the father of the bride, buys the groom a set of Talmud, and it's actually called a chassan shas, a groom's Talmud. Why? Because it's considered standard that he's going to need a set of Talmud that's going to be in the house. They're building their life based on the Talmud. This one that's right here was bought for me by Rabbi Anoka, my father-in-law, a few weeks before I got married, and it's been with me ever since. I still haven't finished the entire set, but I'm working on it. I'm in the middle of studying Tractate Shabbat and Tractate Eruvin, for those of you that are keeping track. Okay, so we selected here 4 samples of what types of laws you can find in the Talmud, right? Why don't we dive into it? And we'll ask each of you to read some of them. I know Shari doesn't really have a textbook yet. Maybe she has the PDF, I don't know. But Phil and Kevin will ask you guys to do 2 and 2. So Phil, why don't you read the ones on page 9, and then Kevin, you'll read the ones on page 10. Okay, the first one comes to us from Tractate Pesachim. It's text 4a. Phil, when you're ready, go ahead.
On the eve of Passover, we may not eat from close to the time of Mincha until it is dark to ensure a hearty appetite for eating matzah at the Passover Seder later that night. And then right to gripe. If one hires skilled workers and they deceived each other, they have only a right to complain, but not to pursue a financial claim.
Okay, so far we have 2 laws, 2 very different laws. One of them is very religious in nature. It's talking about eating matzah when the right time to eat matzah is. Well, I'm sorry, not the right time. How in advance of eating matzah, you should make sure not to eat too much, because if you eat too much, then you won't have a hearty appetite for eating matzah, right? The second one is much more, it looks like almost labor law, employment law, right? If you hire skilled workers, whether they have a right to complain or they don't have a right to complain, okay. Beautiful. Let's keep going. Kevin, text 4c.
All who are obligated to ritually immerse must do so during the day, with the exception of a woman who is nida or yoledet, post-menstruation or post-birth, who must ritually immerse at night.
Okay, that's text 4C. Text 4D, go ahead. A place for everyone.
Every Jewish individual has a share in the world to come, as it is stated, your people are all righteous. They will inherit the land forever. They are the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, in which I take pride.
Okay, so you may have noticed. Okay, so text 4C was a law about mikvah, about going to the mikvah. Most of you are probably familiar with the going to the mikvah, which is like a ritual immersion in a bath. We have actually one. We have a building here at Chabad, which is a full mikvah. Most of you are probably familiar with that being a mitzvah that is for women, right? Based on their menstrual cycle, etc. They go to the mikvah and they go by night. But actually, back in temple times, when all the laws of purity and impurity applied, which today they don't, because the temple is not standing, in those times there would have been lots of other times that someone would have need to ritually immerse, and all of those are done by day. But a woman who is post-menstruation or post-birth, she immerses at night. It's a law about that, right? Now, text 4D is a very different type of quote from the Talmud. It's not even a law. It just seems like an inspiring thought. It's telling us that all Jews have a share in the world to come. Everybody's soul is going to live forever and have a reward in the world to come, etc. And he brings a proof from a verse. The first three passages are all laws. That's all what we call halacha. And we've selected them in this proportion because that's the way it is in the Talmud. If you were to go through all the Talmud and label them as halacha or agadata, you would find that 3/4 of them are halacha, which we said is Jewish law, and 1/4 is what we call agadata. What is agadata? Agadata, take a look on page 11, you'll see that this is our second key term. Agadata is non-legal sections of the Talmud. Topics covered could include records of historical and contemporary events, homiletic interpretations of biblical texts, ethical, spiritual, medicinal, and practical teachings and advice. Okay? These are usually the ones you hear people quoting. These are the ones people are, oh, the Talmud says, right? People are not often talking about the legal parts of it. They're usually talking about the inspirational quotes or the ethical teachings or the practical advice or the medicinal advice, etc., etc. All of those things are part of the Talmud, and they're interspersed, by the way, within each other. It's not as organized a work as you would see in the modern contemporary world, where everything is organized by categories and chapters and subheadings and headlines, etc. However, on the page, as you're going through, you'll have sometimes halacha, and then in the middle, there will be a little bit of agadata, a little bit of these ethical teachings thrown in. Usually, the Talmud is very famous for going off topic. It'll start on one topic and then slowly meander its way towards another. Now, in lesson 4, we are going to explore the presence of agadata in the Talmud, why it's there, what purpose it serves, etc. But for right now, we're going to focus on the portion called halacha, which, as we said, is 3/4 of the. How do I clear the annotations here? There we go. Which, as mentioned, is about 3/4 of the book. Okay, now, not just the book, the whole set of books, which is 5,422 single-sided pages in total. Okay, now let's go back to what we said about Mishnah. Okay, so the make of the Talmud is 3/4 halacha, 1/4 agadata. Okay, now in agadata, in halacha, in the Jewish law, it is divided into Mishnah and Gemara. Okay, I feel like we did enough of that as we did beforehand. It is basically the laws and then the legal analysis of that. Okay. Yes. The only thing the last thing I want to say before we start to talk about two more topics that are very important. The last thing I want to say is I want to talk about this word law, because I've translated halacha as Jewish law, but I think that we got to do a little bit of defining of the terms, if you will. Why is that? I think when your average layman today, a modern ear, hears the word law, we usually think of a very specific type of law. We think of laws that prevent people from hurting each other, like prohibitions against assault or fraud or environmental and product regulations, etc. Those are laws, right? They help society function in that way. We think of laws that define people's obligations to their society and their government. So think of things like taxes and zoning, right? There's zoning because we want to make sure that every neighborhood has a certain identity, etc. Think of the laws right now that they either are enacting or not enacting with regards to the rebuilding of Altadena, right? That has much more to do with the protection of a certain type of neighborhood or a certain type of substances being in the air that are harmful to people, etc., etc. So that's more obligations to your society and to your government, okay? And finally, the laws that regulate interactions between people to smooth out our interactions between people. So we have business interactions with people. We have, right, different types of interactions. Think of traffic laws, for example, right? The fact that there are certain traffic laws, speeding limits and red lights and green lights, etc. All of that, those are to regulate our interactions between different people. Think of commercial regulations, what you are and are not allowed to do in business, right? I think this is mainly what we think of when we think of laws. But Jewish law, remember, is a very different type of body of law. It includes those things as well, all the things mentioned, but it will also have religious laws. It will also have spiritual laws. Now, I want to say something. When we think of laws, we immediately think of any law only being worth however much it's enforced. So let's say I told you that maybe I found somewhere deep down in some sort of law, somewhere in the Pasadena laws, I find somewhere that on Tuesdays everybody has to wear black, right? And you tell me, okay, interesting fact, doesn't really affect my life. And I tell you, what do you mean? Aren't you a resident of Pasadena? Shouldn't you need to wear black on Tuesdays? And you say, yeah, but nobody does, A. B, nobody enforces it. In other words, nobody even says that people should wear black. So it's if it's not enforceable, it may as well just not be a law. That's not true from a Torah law perspective. Why? Because the Torah is considered laws that are given by God. So if a person subscribes to those laws, if a person says, I want to try and be a Torah observant Jew, there doesn't need to be any sort of enforcement. It's not like God says, if you don't wear black on Tuesday, I'll strike you with lightning and after you. No. If you're actually an observant Jew and you want to follow it, then you follow because you believe that that's the way of God. But they are still called laws from a Jewish perspective. So that will be things like religious obligations to God. Think of your tefillin, your talit, your mezuzah, your yarmulke, your kippah, right? All of those things, they're all laws. They're all Torah laws. To wear a kippah, to put on tefillin, etc., right? Laws that prohibit certain types of behaviors that don't necessarily affect other people, right? Think, for example, of kosher, right? That we're not allowed to eat non-kosher animals, that we're not allowed to have certain types of relationships, adultery, incest, nida. All of these types of laws are what we would call laws from a Jewish perspective, not necessarily in the modern world would they be called laws. Special days on the calendar, all the holidays, fasting on Yom Kippur, lighting candles on Shabbat, all of those things would be part of these types of laws. There are also laws in the Torah. Agricultural practices, right? So the fact that when you plant, you have to give a certain percentage to poor people, all this sort of thing. Again, laws that are from the Torah. However, we wouldn't necessarily call them laws in today's vernacular. Same thing for worship that's done in the Holy Temple and ritual purity or impurity. All of these are what I call law for the purposes of our conversation. Now, it should be noted that the extraordinary broad scope of halacha has been the subject of ridicule. There's a picture of shoes here for a reason, because there's actually a law about in what order and exactly how you're supposed to put on your shoes and tie your shoes. Let's do it. It's a fun fact, so let's do it. An observant Jew will put on his right shoe first, but not tie it, then put on his left shoe, then tie his left shoe, and then tie his right shoe. That is the appropriate way for a Jew to tie his shoes, right? So you can see this kind of conduct being ridiculed by non-Jews throughout the generations. But I actually think that it also shows in the beauty of it. If you're actually following the ways of God, if you're trying to be a godly person, so then that actually encompasses every single part of your lives. So all of these laws will be in the Talmud. Okay. We have about 50 minutes left to our lesson. And what I'd like to do in that time is I'd like to answer two major questions, okay? Why do I format the class this way? Because I've studied Talmud with people before. And very often, not very often, almost certainly, these two questions will come up within the first few times that you sit down to study Talmud. So I want to do my best to get them out of the way now, and I'm going to spend about 25 minutes on each of them to really address them properly, because it'll really give you a good idea. Question number one is, where did this body of law come from? You told me there's 5,422 pages, right? You told me it quotes 120 Mishnaic sages, and then another 800 Talmudic sages. You've told me that it encompasses every single part of my life. It's 3/4 halacha, which means law, and law doesn't just mean laws between society and what the modern world would look at as law, but it even means how I tie my shoes and how I go to the bathroom, right? So where did this body of law come from? And I don't mean give me the history of it. We're going to do that over the next few weeks. I mean, is this godly? So God told us to Moses at Sinai, like what? Where does it fall in that hierarchy? And question number two is, why on earth would I spend time studying it? Okay? If it's a book of law, think about it. When's the last time you studied a book of law? Well, Phil, you're an exception. You're a lawyer by trade, right? But to everybody else, when's the last time you opened up a book of law and started studying law? If you're an average layman, you go about and you do your thing. Unless you're involved in some sort of dispute, then maybe you'll study some laws, right? Why do Jews insist on studying law all the time? Why is that such an important part of our identity with all the emotion that we spoke about in the first 20, 30 minutes of the class? Okay? So we're going to spend 25 minutes on question one, 25 minutes on question two. Question one, where did this body of law come from? Or to put it in the way it's usually asked, even if it's a little bit crass or a little bit crude, was all of this made up by the rabbis? You'll often hear Talmudic law, for example, called rabbinic law. And I actually think that's maybe not an accurate description, but either way, where does this Talmudic law come from? Is it just a whole bunch of rabbis that made it up? Why? Because when people say, is it just a whole bunch of rabbis that made it up, they want to know, is this wisdom of the sages? And sometimes it's not even said crassly. Sometimes somebody is asking very genuinely, is this actually wisdom from the sages? Is that what I'm looking at here? And the real more accurate description of it is that it's not really wisdom of the sages as much as it is the sages' effort, all of those, almost 1,000 sages we discussed, it's their effort to record the will and wisdom of God. Let me explain. Let me explain it in this way. We all know about the Torah, right? How would you translate the Torah? Would it not be right to translate it as the law? Right? Doesn't the Torah have all these laws? So why is there a need for another book, right? The Talmud, which is also going to give us the law. So you might be familiar with the fact that the Torah is often called the written law, and the Talmud is called the oral law. All right? Let's take a look at text 5, and we'll get an idea of what this is all about. Phil, if you can read for us, please, written and oral.
All of the commandments that were given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai and recorded in the 5 books of Moses were presented to Moses along with their detailed explanation that were not recorded in those books. The Torah itself refers to this in its statement, I will give you the tablets of stone and the Torah and the mitzvah. In this context, the phrase the Torah refers to the written law. The phrase the mitzvah refers to the explanation of the written law. God commanded us to fulfill the Torah in accordance with the mitzvah. It is the latter instructions that we refer to as the oral law.
Okay, so this statement, which is made by Maimonides, reflects a tradition which he had received up until his time, which we've continued since his time. He lived in the 1400s. In the 1200s. And what is that statement? He's saying that not just the written law was given by God, but actually all of the oral law was also given by God. And next week we're going to talk about when that oral tradition was written down and why it was written down. But basically what he's saying is that all of it is just as accurate as the written law. Now I have 2 questions for that. Number one, that sounds mighty convenient, right? Whole bunch of rabbis quoting a whole bunch of things throughout the Talmud, and you're telling me, all right, so it's also oral law, right? It's also comes directly from God. It's just oral, not written, and they're just recording the oral law. Very convenient, number one. Number two, how do we know that it's accurate? So, really, right now, I'm going to make a referral. There was a course that I gave all on this topic. It was called Judaism Decoded. And it was all about the oral law and the evolution of the Torah and how that became, all of that sort of thing, and where all of it comes from, etc. I'm going to try to give you a condensed version of that now in 20 minutes. But I do want to mention that we are going to be studying the Talmud and its place in Judaism. If you'd like to, you could take that 6-lesson course. I will link it in the after lesson email. It's a course called Judaism Decoded. But if you don't have the time to take it, which is what I'm assuming most people are not going to have the time to take it, so then here's my recommendation to you. If we're studying the place that the Talmud has in Judaism, you need to be able to appreciate that all of the authors of the Talmud and all those that study the Talmud take it as the word of God. Okay? Now, how does that work? It works in a few different ways, which we'll discuss now in about 20 minutes. But I want you to understand that every single person that studies the Talmud appreciates it as the word of God. So, in order to understand how oral law works, I always find it convenient to split it into 3 categories. All right, and that kind of becomes the evolution, if you will, of the oral law. So you have the written law, right? We all know what that is, right? God spoke to Moses at Sinai 3,330, 6 years now ago, on a mountain in the Sinai desert called Mount Sinai. God called him up to the mountain in front of all the Jewish people. He came down. He told them the 10 Commandments, and then Moses went up to Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. In those 40 days and 40 nights, God taught him the entire Torah and basically told him as follows. Number 1, he had him write down word for word the words of the Torah. But that's only the 5 books of Moses. That's only the written law. And ever since that time, we've been copying that law in the Bible, in the Torah scroll, the one that you see in the synagogue when they take it out on a Saturday, on a Shabbat, and they read from the Torah. That's the exact words. And by the way, it's fascinating to me that despite the fact that we have millions of Jews around the world, and they run such a kaleidoscope. There's Ashkenazim and Sephardim, there's Orthodox, there's Reform, and there's Conservative, and there's Reconstructionist, and there's Israeli, and there's American, and there's French, and there's European, and all shebang. And yet, if you open up any Torah scroll in any synagogue, maybe with the exception of one letter, literally one letter, in a word called daka, which maybe has an aleph, maybe has a hey, every single letter is exactly the same. So that's the written law that came from Moses at Sinai. Beautiful. But together with that came the oral law. And the oral law is divided into what I would call 3 genres, okay? And any particular law that you'd be learning in the Talmud would be one of those 3 genres. The first category is what I'm going to call received. Received means there were certain things that God told Moses and that Moses told the Jewish people immediately together with the written law. Now, why that's necessary is beyond the scope of today's conversation. If he had more to say, why didn't he just write it down, right? It turns out there's a very good reason for that. It's beyond the scope of today's conversation. Again, I refer you to Judaism Decoded. But for now, what does received mean? It means that Moses received laws. He wrote down some things, and then God told him, together with that, I want to tell you more details about it. And then you're going to pass that down orally. And remember, for the most part of Jewish history until the Talmud, the Jewish people are in one major locale. We think today, there's Jews in Pasadena and Altadena and Los Angeles and New York and in Australia, in France, etc., right? No. For the most part, the Jews are wandering together in the desert. Then they arrive in Israel, so that's 40 years. Then they arrive in Israel. They're in Israel for about 400 years altogether. They build the first temple. That's another 400 years. They're still all in Israel. After the destruction of the first temple, they become a little bit dispersed. And that's when the Talmud arrives on the scene. But that dispersion, by the way, is it's still Middle East. It's still Israel and Iraq, Iran. So it's still Israel and Babylon. But even then, because of that dispersion, that's part of the topic next week that we're going to talk about when the oral law gets written down. The reason I'm telling you this, I'm reminding you that there's this strong concentration of Jews is because the oral law is constantly being repeated. Okay? So let's give an example of received tradition. If you open up the Torah and you look for the mitzvah of tefillin, here's what you're going to find. Ukshartem leot al yadecha v'hayu letotafot beinenecha. You should bind them for a sign on your arm and for frontlets between your eyes. Okay? What does that mean? Why don't I take, an iPhone and put it up here and put the name of God on it? Right? So together with the written word, these two cryptic sentences, which tell you that there's some sort of mitzvah that you're supposed to be putting on your arm and on your head between your eyes, together with that comes the received tradition. In other words, God told Moses immediately they should be black, they should be leather from the hide of a kosher animal. There should be parchments inside. On those parchments should be written the words of the Shema, etc., etc. So that was the received portion that went together with the written portion, which was only 2 lines. Okay. The next section is what we are going to call derived. Okay? Derived means that this is a law that was never passed down directly from Moses at Sinai, but it still has a lot of authority. Why? Because any body of wisdom is going to go through an evolution process. 500 years later, people are speaking differently, doing different things, etc., right? So take, for example, back in the day, they said you could not light a fire on Shabbat. I don't light a fire on most days of the week, right? But I turn on electricity. So who decided that gets applied in that way, right? And even way before electricity and new modern inventions, there was always lots of derivation that needed to happen from the Torah. In other words, they needed a system by which they can look at the Torah and derive a law from the Torah that maybe wasn't passed down to them from Sinai. And in order to do this, Moses passed down literally no more than 13 principles, 13 rules of how to derive from the Torah. And that is text 6. Kevin, can you read it for us, please? Legal authority on page 14, text 6, which is basically in the Torah, God is telling the Jewish people that you might need to derive later on in life.
If regarding matters of dispute within your local courts, a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over blood, civil law, or lesions, you must rise up and ascend to the supreme judge in that era. You should inquire, and they must inform you of the correct verdict in the case. You must carry out the verdict that is announced to you, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. You must act in accordance with the instructions they give you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate to the right or to the left from the rulings that they announce to you.
Okay, and this is the second genre of Jewish oral law, which is something that is derived from the Torah. So you will often hear somebody say, because it says this word in the Torah, from this we derived that this is the way we need to operate, etc. The third category is legislation. And if you have a problem with rabbis, this is where you should let out your frustration. Legislation is, by the same token in text 6, God told Moses, I'm giving the sages, and there's rules to how this works. It has to be a body of rabbis, and they have to be a formal Jewish court of law, etc., etc. But I am giving them the power to be able to enact new laws or legislation. And every single one of those has to be labeled dirabanan and not minatorah, which means it's a rabbinic decree, it's a rabbinic law, as opposed to a Torah law that comes directly from the Torah. These, by the way, are not. We'll talk about the chronology of it soon. I want to talk about when these laws started to evolve in their way. First, I want to do a certain exercise with you, okay? On page 15 in your book, you have a text 7, okay? And then, on the bottom of page 15, you have a chart. What I'd like to show you is all 4 of these categories. The written law, and then the 3 types of oral law, received, derived, and legislated, right? Which, on the top bar, you can see a reminder of what each of those categories is. I'd like you to watch all that play out in one verse. So here's the verse, text 7. Barishon barba'asa yom lachodesh ba'erev tochlu matzot. In the first month, on the 14th day of that month, in the evening you shall eat matzot. Right? Seems like a pretty straightforward law, right? You should eat matzah. It tells you when to eat the matzah. Beautiful. Okay? First question, how much matzah should I eat? Should I eat 1 matzah? Should I eat 3 matzot? How big do the matzot need to be? Right? So for this, we go to the received. It turns out that together with this verse, God also told Moses, and this was a tradition passed down fathers to sons, and obviously they would remember this each year on Passover, that the amount of matzah that you should eat is an olive-sized quantity of matzah. All right? This is a received tradition that goes all the way back to Sinai. That's the size, that's how much matzah you should eat. So if you take a matzah, grind it up, take out all the air, And today already, if you look in modern Jewish books, they'll tell you how many ounces you need to have of matzah. Beautiful. And with this, you fulfill your obligation of eating matzah on Passover. Beautiful. But now we have some more questions. What are the other questions we have? In the times of the Jewish people in the desert, right, or wherever, or at Sinai, they had maybe wheat, barley, maybe some spelt or some oats. Today, there's lots of different types of flour that you can use. Can I have a matzah made out of almond flour? What about rice flour? Right? So the problem is that was not something that was passed down from Moses at Sinai. So we have to turn to the second category, which is the derived category. The sages basically derived the law of matzah from the law of chametz. Chametz is the Hebrew word for the opposite of matzah, leavened bread, right? So what did they say? They said matzah has to be bread just like chametz, just it has to not rise. So rice flour does not rise. No matter what you do to rice flour, you're not going to get it to rise. Cornmeal, not going to rise. Almond flour, not going to rise. You might be able to puff it up with other ingredients, right? But naturally, it will not rise. So therefore, the rabbis derived from the Torah, okay? Now, I don't want to get into all the principles, but of the 13 principles of how you derive from the Torah, one of them is called a hekesh. A hekesh means a proximity derivation. Two mitzvot right next to each other in the Torah, they must be similar. So because in the same breath, the Torah tells you, don't eat leavened bread and eat matzah, so we assume they're both made out of the same type of grain. So from this comes the law that your matzah has to be made of a grain that can rise. Wheat, barley, spelt, oats, rye. I think that's it, just those 5. Matzah has to be made of one of those 5, and that's it. You cannot eat rice matzah. I mean, you could eat rice matzah, but it's not going to be good for the fulfilling of the mitzvah of eating matzah. And you can, the same thing with almond matzah or anything else like that. Okay, let's move on to legislation, right? The sages also have the responsibility to legislate rules that will enhance the observance of the mitzvot or for whatever reason, right? Okay, now, the sages legislated that on the night of Passover, when you're eating the matzah, you should do it leaning to the left. You might have heard this. Why? Why do we lean to the left? To look like a free person, right? Because you have the freedom of your own body. Okay. Agree with it or don't agree with it. It was legislated by a body of rabbis back in ages and ages ago. And that becomes part of the body of Torah, albeit with a distinction that we know that that was legislated by the rabbis. Now, all 3 of these categories together are called oral law, right? They're all part of the oral law. The law goes from written, you have received, you have derived, and you have legislated. And now, this also should shed some light to you on the chronology of it. Why? Because when was the written Torah given? We know that. About 3,330 something years ago. In the Hebrew year of 2,448. The received portion of the Torah we know was given together with it. Came with Moses at Sinai. The derived portion we know was not given then. All that was given then was the principles for how to derive. So the derived portion evolved from then as time went on. And finally, the laws that were legislated also were enacted by the sages of various generations. But here's the thing. They also started right away. We have it on good authority, on good tradition, that Moses legislated some of these laws. For example, Moses legislated that we should read the Torah. We should never go more than 3 days without reading the Torah. So if you walk into a synagogue and they have a service going on Saturday they read the Torah, you know that. They also read it on Mondays and they also read it on Thursdays. That was legislated by Moses. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to read it that often. Moses is the one who legislated that we should read the Torah on a semi-consistent basis. King David legislated, King Solomon legislated, and there's different legislations that have a name attached to them that we know who it was that legislated this particular thing. A large number of enactments, by the way, come to us during the time around the building of the Second Temple, which is the 4th century BCE, as I discussed. And there was another slew of ordinances that were ordained right after the Second Temple was destroyed. These 2 times were very big moments, if you will, in Jewish history. When the first temple when the Second Temple is built, you have a lot of these exilees that are coming back up to Jerusalem, right? Because there's a second temple now. As a result, they had to enact a whole bunch of enactments to reinforce Judaism, if you will. Same thing happens when the second temple is destroyed and it becomes clear the Jews are going into exile permanently, well, not permanently, but for a very long time, right, after the Roman conquest of Israel. So this is around 70 CE. At that time, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his body of rabbis, if you will, his court of rabbis, they also make a lot of legislation in order to preserve Judaism into the exile. Again, this is just fun facts. But what I hope you're walking out with is really text 8. That no matter what you're talking about here, and Phil, if I can ask you to read this for us, whether you're talking about the written law, so an observant Jew today will keep the written law, laws that are derived, that are part of the oral Torah, laws that are legislated that are part of the oral Torah, or laws that are received part of the oral Torah, he will keep them all equally. And that's because of this verse in text 8, observing the covenant.
If you listen to my voice and carefully observe my covenant, you will be a treasure to me from among all the nations. All the people responded in unison, and they proclaimed, all that God has spoken, we will do.
So all 4 parts of the law are of Jewish law, the written and received and derived and legislated, they're all parts of the commitment that we made to God to do all that God has spoken. Why? Because God set this system up in advance that this is the way Torah should evolve. I hope this does some justice to the question of, oh, the Talmud is the oral law. That basically means it's just a whole bunch of rabbis that made stuff up and you can either take it or leave it. I hope this gives you some idea to the fact that it's not just brand new stuff. There's a system to how it evolved and where it comes from, etc. But hopefully that's enough of a crash course on what oral law is. Again, the reason we did this just now, for the past 25 minutes, we went through what oral law is and how it evolved, even though really there's a 6-lesson course, again, titled Judaism Decoded, and I encourage you to go watch it on your own time. If you do a lot of driving, that's a great thing to listen to. But the reason that I spent 25 minutes on this now is because it is very common. Next week and the week afterwards, as we're going to start to dive into the Talmud, and you're going to see something you don't like, it's very common for people to say, oh, this Talmud, it's just a whole bunch of rabbis that made it up. It's important to understand that that's not what Talmud is, and that's not how Jews have looked at Talmud throughout history. Jews have always looked at Talmud as the word of God to one degree or another. That's fine. How arguable it is and how there's details to that, as we discussed. But generally speaking, it's all part of the covenant that we promised Hashem that we are going to keep. Okay. In the remaining time that we have, which is about 20, 25 minutes, I'd like to focus on question number 2. Why is a book of a law such an important part of Judaism? Okay, and by the way, to emphasize this point, I want to just say something. You can buy, I might have one on the shelf here. Yeah. You can buy a Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, the name literally means a set table. If you open this up, it just says, here's what you do on this day. Shabbat, you light candles, you eat challah, you make kiddush, you put on tefillin, and that's it. And it doesn't bother you with all the in and the out and the analysis and how the law came about and the history, etc. Right? So that is obvious that every single Jew should be studying that because you want to know what to do, right? But why would you study a book of a law that's kind of like the whole evolution of the law? You know, it's like in the United States. Imagine if I told you have somebody, he's been driving for years, but he still studies all the books on the laws of driving, not just the little handbook that you give a 16-year-old when they're just studying for their driver's permit. No, he's studying all. Why? What are you, a ticket officer? Do you help people fight tickets? Then great. But if not, if you're not a lawyer, right? Why would you study law? Let me put this question one more way. Kevin, can you read for us, please? By the way, Shari, I don't know if you have a text in front of you. So you want to read for us, Shari? You want to try to read for us? Text 9 is a statement about our relationship with God. By the way, before we do it, and maybe I should have done it before I pull up this slide. If you can all just unmute yourselves and give me an idea how we connect to God. If I tell you have a relationship with God, what mechanism are you using to connect to God? Anybody have a way?
Wrap tefillin.
Okay, so that's a mitzvah.
Mm-hmm.
By doing a mitzvah. Any other way besides for doing a mitzvah you can connect with God?
I don't know. I connect with God all day long.
How? What do you do?
First of all, I'm alive and I'm breathing. To me,
Okay.
it's godly in itself.
Okay.
Okay, what else? Every interaction I have with other people, I stop and think what will be the highest way for me to behave.
Okay. I would say that goes into the category of mitzvot. So one way that we have to connect with God is with mitzvot, by being a good person and doing good things. Can anybody think of another moment in our day or in our week where we connect with God in a different way, other than with action in a different way?
Well, do you consider prayer and meditation?
Very good. Yes, absolutely. I would say that's a second one. Praying. Praying to God is a second one. That's another way to connect to God is through prayer. What's a third one? I'm just looking for 3 in total. I'll give you a hint. We're doing it right now.
Study.
Studying.
Torah study. Torah study. If you take a look, Shari, if you can read for us text 9, Tripart Foundation, our literature actually says this very clearly, that there's 3 ways to connect to God. Go ahead.
Could you please tell me again which page it is?
Page
9?
18, text 9, Tripart Foundation.
Great, I'm delighted. I just found it. Okay. See, I'm originally from New York, but not anymore. So I don't talk that fast. So hold on. I don't even think that fast. Hold on.
That's okay. Shimon the Righteous. Yes, you see it?
Shimon the Righteous was one of the last surviving figures of the men of the Great Assembly. He used to say, the world stands upon 3 things: the Torah, the temple service, and acts of loving kindness.
So these are the 3 pillars upon which the world stands. Number
Thank
1 is prayer, right? Or the temple service. The temple service has been replaced by prayer. The temple service was supposed to be a form of prayer, and today we do that just with books in the synagogue. The second one is mitzvot, or acts of kindness. And the third one is Torah, okay? Now, although Jews value Torah learning of every type, I think it's worth noting that Judaism puts an emphasis on the study of Talmud or halacha specifically. And what I want to know is why? Why do Jews study so much law? And in order to explain this, on page 19, we have an exercise. You don't need to write it. If I can get somebody... Kevin, can I pick on you? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. I want you to identify the last 1, 2, or 3 efforts that you made to study a material that was not from the Torah or other Jewish learning, maybe an educational book, a video, or a course, and just tell us what they were. Some sort of recent educational endeavor that you did, whether it's a video that you decided, and anybody else can jump in here if you guys are ready to already. And I know it takes some thinking.
So I've been trying to learn. I recently traveled to Mexico and I wanted to try to brush up and beef up my knowledge of Spanish.
Okay,
So I've
so
been
you've
doing,
been learning a language, Spanish.
yeah,
And the reason is because you've been going a lot to Mexico and you feel it'll be practical to help you navigate.
and just some for self-improvement.
Okay,
And
I'll share one. I'll go next. Recently, we experienced a particular medical issue in our family, which thank God is over and everybody's fine. So, but during that window, I did a lot of research. Maybe that's just my style. I did a ton of research on this medical thing and what could go wrong and what could go right and what type of treatments there are that could be dealt with it, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I did that, obviously, is because we were experiencing it. Does anybody else have another example?
Yes, I do, please. Yes, I study mental health nutrition.
Oh, well, you do that for a living. So then for sure.
Mostly a personal passion, but I have the opportunity to help
Okay.
people.
In
Yeah.
other words, what I think we're seeing is that most times if people study something, it's either because they're forced to, right? So that's school or maybe mandatory trainings at work or that kind of thing, right? Or because there's some sort of practical takeaway they hope to take from it, which is something like improving themselves or acquiring a skill or a hobby or a passion or improving their character, or maybe they find it interesting, so they want to amass this particular type of knowledge. You know, I was at a different class where somebody asked a similar type of question and somebody answered, I recently took a course on how to use Microsoft Excel. Why? Because, I don't remember, maybe it affected their work or whatever it was, right? Interestingly, Jewish learning includes many of these elements. It can be character improvement. It can help you in all these different things, right? But a lot of Jewish learning is very impractical. It doesn't have to do with it. It's not necessarily theological. It's not necessarily inspirational. It won't necessarily affect your life, and yet we still study it. And when we look carefully at what Jews study, you'll see that there's supposed to be a particular time of study dedicated to Talmud. Kevin, you want to read for us, please, on page 20, text 10, study plan.
The time allotted to study should be divided into three parts. A third should be devoted to the written law, a third to the oral law, and the last third should be spent in reflection, deducing conclusions from premises, developing implications of statements, comparing statements, and studying the hermeneutical principles by which the Torah is interpreted until one knows the essence of these principles and how to deduce what is permitted and what is forbidden from what one has learned by tradition. The latter topic is called Gemara.
Gemara, remember, is synonymous with Talmud. In other words, tradition mandates that we spend a full third of our time studying the laws of the oral Torah and another third in the analysis of the derivations of those laws, right? So 2/3 are spent studying halacha. Now, take a second to think when the last time you studied a law is, right? Most, as I mentioned, most of us, unless you're a lawyer, don't often study law. Now, why would you study law so much? Why would we study so much law? So one simple answer would be, and that's text 11. The Talmud tells us, the Mishnah tells us very clearly, the study is not the principal goal, but rather the action, in order to know what to do. But as I mentioned, not everything is going to fall under that category. It partially answers our question, but what about all the cases that are totally irrelevant? All the situations in the Torah that are discussed about purity and impurity, for example, which are not relevant to us right now. Hopefully will be relevant again with the coming of Mashiach, but until that time comes, totally irrelevant to us. What about all these other parts of the Talmud that were like, so a Jew is sitting and studying Torah law, it's not all about some sort of practical takeaway. It's not inspiring necessarily. It's not because of curiosity necessarily. So why are we studying it? And this is the final point that I want to make for today's lesson. There is another aspect of Torah study that is actually spiritual in nature. It's a form of service to God. You know, in the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, the Alter Rebbe, that was the first Rebbe of Chabad. He was arrested by the Tsarist regime, and on trumped up charges that somebody had reported him on. Anyways, without getting into the whole history of it, there's an interrogation that's recorded about how they interrogated him about Hasidism, and you know, he was the founder of Chabad Hasidism and what Chabad Hasidism is all about. You know, so there's a lot of theological questions they asked him. In the middle of the interrogation, it's fascinating. He shares the following insight. Phil, you want to read it for us, please? Text 12.
That which we refer to in our Russian language as Boga, Malitia, divine service, is divided by all of us Jews into two parts. The first is the reading and studying of the scriptures, Talmud, Midrashim, and their commentaries, as well as the study of the legal codes that summarize the laws of the Talmud. The second aspect is the concept of prayer.
In other words, to the Alter Rebbe, studying Torah is a divine service, similar to prayer. You know how you come in and somebody might be praying and swaying back and forth, maybe meditating, and their mind is in a different place because they're trying to commune with the divine, they're trying to connect with a higher power? Torah study is supposed to be similar. This is fascinating. I don't know any other culture or any other area of even of Jewish life where a person would consider study to be a service. Studying is understanding something, is learning something, is learning more about the world. To treat Torah study as a service of God in and of itself, there's a reason why when I asked you guys for the 3 ways we can connect with God, Torah study was the one I had to really pull out of you by the teeth. Does anybody feel like they're serving God right now? We don't typically think of it that way. But the Alter Rebbe is actually saying that we should think of it that way. Why? Because to study Torah is not just to grasp some sort of intellect, it's something much deeper. To study Torah is God's will and wisdom. And the study of Torah is therefore intellectually grasping God's will and wisdom. When I say I'm studying Torah, what I am essentially doing is trying to grasp. Study means to grasp, right? What I'm trying to grasp is God's will and wisdom. And that, as we're going to see, is a very spiritual service indeed. Shari, if you can read it for us, please. On page 24, text 13 really sheds light onto this interesting phenomenon.
Okay, here we go. Knowing the unknowable from Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Okay. Halacha is God's wisdom and will. For so it arose in God's will that if, for example, Reuben pleads in one way and Shimon in another, the verdict should be such and such. Now, it is possible that this particular litigation never occurred in reality, nor is it ever destined to be presented for judgment as these precise disputes and claims. Nevertheless, God's will and wisdom has determined that in the event of a person pleading this way and the other litigant pleading that way, the verdict shall be such and such.
Keep going.
Okay. Accordingly, when we study and understand and properly comprehend with our intellect the details of such a scenario in accordance with the law presented in the Mishnah, Gemara, or Poskim, the later codes, we have thereby comprehended, grasped, and encompassed with our intellect the will and the wisdom of God. We have effectively understood something of the one whom no thought can grasp and whose will and wisdom are beyond understanding, until they are invested within the laws that have been set out for us.
Thank you, Shari. Let me explain. That might have been a little bit of a cryptic text, but hopefully I can ground this for you so you really understand it. The mystics teach us that God is unknowable, right? However, they also teach us that God took his will and his wisdom, in other words, what he wants, and the way that he thinks, himself, and he put himself into the Torah. So when you study Torah, you are in effect studying God. So, whereas any other study, you would be right for asking, what are you getting out of it? Right? In other words, okay, you sat for an hour. Now what? Did you understand what you learned? What did you gain? What is the new tool that you have? For example, if I'm giving a 90-minute lesson now, you might be able to ask yourself at the beginning of the lesson, what did I have? And now at the end of the 90 minutes, what do I have? Now I know what I grew and what I gained from this lesson. I can decide whether it's worth it or not. Different than all of this comes Torah study. And this is why you're going to see this in Talmudic study. It's not about what you're going to get out of it. It's about the experience itself. So even if, let's say, for example, for 60 minutes straight, you're going to try and understand a law in the Torah, and you don't understand it by the end of it. Or worse, you understand it, but actually it turns out it will never happen. This case will never happen in history. Reuben said this, and Shimon said this, and they come before the court of law, and this is the law. It never happened in history, and it never will happen in history. So then why am I spending an hour, pray tell, and studying it? Because it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. In those 60 minutes, what happens is that your brain and God's wisdom become melded. There's a fusion with the divine. In other words, the study of Torah is actually intellectually grasping God's will and wisdom, which is God himself, because God put himself into the Torah. So it becomes a divine act. It becomes just like praying. Nobody ever asks, why do Jews pray so much? They're religious. They like to connect with God. So therefore they pray. They're talking to God, and God hopefully is answering them. And there's this moment where they're trying to become close to God, right? Torah study is the same thing. So if you spend 1 hour studying Torah, even if you didn't understand it, but you attempted to understand it, you spent an hour with God. And that's a very, very powerful point. In case anybody's familiar with this, I want to just give like one parallel to this, even though it's probably not exactly equal, but it's definitely a big part of it. I forget where this wisdom comes from, but there are 5 levels of intimacy. Has anybody ever heard this before? Raise a hand. Anybody ever hear the 5 levels of intimacy? Physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy. I forget all 5. Anyways, it's not a Jewish thing. Intellectual intimacy is the following act. It's where 2 people, and this doesn't have to be in a romantic relationship, this can be between 2 friends as well. It's where 2 friends come to talk to each other, not about very superficial topics, not about anything that's going to be practical later in their lives, just to understand each other. Not even emotional. It might not even be emotional. They spend time understanding the way the other person's brain works. Usually, this is fueled by curiosity. I am curious to understand the way your brain works. So I'm going out of my brain And I'm going to use my brain to understand you and the way you work and the way your brain thinks, or maybe an idea that you're trying to share with me, for no other purpose other than that we should be on the same wavelength intellectually. And this is a form of intimacy where two people can actually become very intimately connected. Okay? Now imagine, which is not really possible by human beings, but by God, God actually invested himself into the wisdom that you're learning. So the Talmud, which is not just study, it's analysis. You use every facet of your brain to understand it, right? But in that minute, what you're doing is you're trying to understand God himself. You're trying to understand God's wisdom and will within which God put himself. And if that's not a reason to study Torah, I don't know what is. So, to just really wrap this point up, take a look at text 14, same author, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Phil, if you can read this one for us, about butchers and scholars. A certain parallel and contrast between butchers and scholars. Phil, can you read for us, please? Page 25, text 14.
A butcher who chops an animal's limbs into pieces and processes its innards is nothing more than a butcher. By contrast, someone who occupies himself with understanding the specific details of Jewish law associated with the limbs of the animal, laws that facilitate the ability to distinguish between an animal that is kosher for consumption and one that is disqualified, that person is revealing and clarifying the divine will and wisdom.
So here's the key. Here's the key. It really doesn't make a difference which law you're talking about. You could be talking about two litigants coming before the court. You could be talking about whether an animal is kosher or not. You could be talking about ritual immersion in a mikveh. You could be talking about every Jew having a portion of the year to come. You could be talking about how much matzah you should eat on Passover, or when you have to stop eating on the day before Passover. It doesn't make a difference which law you're discussing. If you invest yourself in it fully, you are investing yourself into God. It's like diving into a pool within which all the water is God, and you're swimming in that water. So you're surrounded by God, and God, and you are surrounding God. So in other words, it's a complete fusion between a immortal human being or a limited human being and the infinite God. Now, the reason this is so important is because we started off asking two questions, right? At the beginning, when we really dove into today's lesson about 60 minutes ago, we asked two questions. Number one is, where did this body of law come from? We gave a little crash course on it, but mainly the main answer to that question is it comes from God. One way or another, in different ways, we treat it as godly wisdom. And number two, why would we spend so much time studying a book of law? It's because we believe that by studying it, we're actually engaged in a spiritual endeavor, a spiritual activity of fusing with God himself. It's a way of serving God. So now I want you to go back to all the emotion of the beginning of the lesson today, right? And you talk about a Jew who's middle of running from the Crusaders, right? Or is, I don't know, Europe is burning up around him, and it's mid-1930s. And he's looking for an hour to run away from it all, right? How did Cecil Roth put it? He doesn't have a fatherland. The book has become his fatherland. Why? Because if he opens up the Talmud and studies Talmud for an hour, now the whole world ceases to exist. It's just him and God, engaged in this intimate dance of their intellects surrounding each other, and in this way connecting with the Almighty. So, the reason that I wanted to start off with the answers to these two questions is because very, very often, and perhaps multiple times over the next 5 weeks, you'll find yourself asking this question. We'll be engaged in the technicalities of some random law, whatever it is, Passover or this or that, whatever it is. And you're going to wonder, why are we spending so much time doing this? Like, let's say, for example, how much matzah you should eat. Eat 5 matzahs and move on. Why are you spending 6 hours trying to figure out how many matzahs you should eat? It's not about how many matzahs we should eat. That is an important fact, and we should definitely get the practical answer for that, but it's much more about the 6 hours that we spend will be time spent connecting with God. And then whenever you'll have this question of, did the rabbis make all this up, hopefully you'll have at least one degree of an answer to this question. This is what I wanted to cover in today's lesson. Thank you all for joining us today. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 1. The Jewish People and the Talmud. 1. The Talmud has influenced every facet of Jewish culture. Its study has been and remains a source of joy for Jewish communities worldwide. One historian suggested that the Talmud is responsible for the Jews having survived their long exile. 2. The Talmud is primarily a record of halacha, Jewish law, which covers every facet of Jewish life, thereby allowing Jews to connect with God in whatever they are doing. 3. Although the written Torah is a source of Jewish law, the vast majority of Jewish law is not explicitly recorded in it. God taught these laws orally to Moses when he gave us the entirety of the Torah at Mount Sinai. 4. In addition to laws received by Moses directly from God, the oral law contains laws that were derived by the sages from the Torah's text, as well as laws legislated by the sages over the generations. 5. The famous Jewish devotion to learning is rooted in the tremendous spiritual significance attributed to Torah study, to the extent that it is considered one of the 3 pillars on which the world stands. Although most Jews are not lawyers or judges, the study of Talmud, Jewish law, occupies a large portion of traditional Jewish study. 6. Jews view the study of law as a mode of religious worship because the laws are the will and wisdom of God. When we absorb Torah law with our minds, we are bonding with a sliver of the divine mind. 7. When we study a Torah law on a given subject, we bring the divine wisdom contained in that law into contact with that subject. And since Jewish law's scope is so broad and that it encompasses every facet of our lives, studying halacha brings holiness into every facet of our lives.
Thank you all for joining us for Lesson 1. This has been The Jewish People and the Talmud, and I look forward to greeting you all next week at Lesson 2, when we will begin our actual dive into the Talmud itself by unpacking the Mishnah and the history behind the Mishnah. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.